Hi, this is Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. My guest grew up in Queens, New York. As a teen, she loved all kinds of music, and she loved listening to the radio. So she aspired to being on the air one day as a disc jockey, but apparently there were bigger plans for her to fulfill, one in the medical profession. Dr. Hannah Brooks is a board-certified surgeon with additional training in cancer genetics. Her specialty is breast diseases and breast cancer. I know very little of Dr. Hannah Brooks or her mother, other than she looms large in her daughter's memory. Dr. Brooks says over time her memories have become amplified because there aren't that many of them. So right now I'd like to give Dr. Brooks a call and hear what she has to say about her mom. So here we go. I really appreciate all of you listening in.
Hello.
Hi, is this Dr. Hannah Brooks?
Hi. Who am I speaking to?
This is Jackie Tantillo from Should Have Listened to My Mother. How are you?
Oh, hi. How are you?
I'm great,
How are
and
you?
I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today on Should Have Listened to My Mother.
No problem. I appreciate it.
All I know briefly from when we spoke the other day, setting up the appointment, that you have some pretty great memories of your mom. So how about if we start off with her name?
My mom's name was Rebecca.
And how did you refer to your mom? How did you, if you were calling for her, what term of endearment would you use?
Mommy.
Mommy. Yay. Okay. And you grew up in Queens, correct?
I was born in Brooklyn, and we moved to Queens when I was about 5. I must preface that I have probably, unlike most people, more limited information on my mother because she did die young.
How old were you?
Well, it's a complicated story. My parents were actually divorced when I was 8, and my father got custody because my mother was what we called then manic depressive. And then she lived first with her only surviving brother and in upstate New York, and then ultimately came back down to New York for a short period of time and lived on in those SROs on the Upper West Side in the 70s. So she ultimately was killed in her little room when I was 19. So there's a complex story around my interactions with my mom.
Okay. Please explain what SROs are.
SRO is a single-room occupancy, which many people might not know what that is, but in the New York City in the 60s and 70s, these were often little buildings where people just basically rented a room, and generally they were filled with people who were lower income or difficult circumstances, either like my mother, mentally ill, on Social Security disability, or sometimes people who had just been released from prison and couldn't find other places to live. So unfortunately, that mix was not a good one.
Right. Some people of questionable character, perhaps.
Right.
And she was alone.
Yes, she lived in that room, and so someone broke into her room.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry.
It was yeah. But I'm sorry to start off with such a.
That's okay. So let's
kind of
take us back.
Story,
Where is it best for you to begin? Tell us some happy memories that you have of your mom. Do you
my
have
happy memories. Well, I would also say that I had limited interaction with her after 8 years old because of the circumstances and because of the divorce. So most of my memories, not so much between 8 and 19, although there are some strong ones, but a lot of my early childhood memories, which were, I would say, unless she was sick, were really great memories. Really great memories.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. Interestingly, my mother, one big tragic story, because she didn't only live through what she lived through here in the States, but she was also an immigrant, and she was basically a survivor of the war in Europe. And so it was only she, at 17, and her 10-year-old brother who survived the Nazi invasion in Paris. And so she essentially had to make her way in life and also get her younger brother over to the States. You know, she had a very complicated story of how she eventually made it here, but she herself had gone through her own pretty tragic preamble to what happened in the U.S. So I have to say that when I think of my mother, I think of somebody who I can only describe in my mind as a saint. I have to say that my mother was, when she was well, was so loving, so caring, did not share the bad parts of the trauma that she had been through with us as children. She literally left that aside. I found out so much about her life much later from my cousin, who where she lived with her younger brother for a short while. And, for example, I didn't even know her own mother had died when she was 11, and she had a stepmother. But she was just always singing in the house. She would listen to the radio, sing along with the radio. She was a great cook. There were 5 of us a year apart. She just took such great care of us. She would read to us. She would sing to us. I remember personally, I think my mother was influenced me so much in terms of my love of nature. She would love to take us to the parks, especially the girls, me and my sister. She would show us flowers. She would teach us French children's songs. She would show us she would just introduce us to just all the beautiful things that we could pay attention to in life. Butterflies and bugs. I'm sure I love bugs because of her. My cousin does too. We're interested in like snakes and frogs and bugs and flowers and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Well, she certainly seemed to have laid down a beautiful, magical path for you. Do you think this was an underlying condition or something that was brought on with age with her or after all the children? She was a soldier and a savior. And that's not an easy task by any means. And to have to get a younger sibling out of Europe, it's difficult even for an adult.
There is no way, even with the things that I've been through in life, I could come close. I think in some ways, we all complain, but when I think about what my mother endured and survived with a positive, with faith, I would say faith is what comes to mind when I think of her. True faith.
Spiritual faith or faith in humanity?
Spiritual faith. Faith in humanity too, but yeah, spiritual faith.
Parents are German?
French. Well, she was Romanian, but lived in France. So she's Parisian in that sense because her family escaped the fascism in Romania. So she was 3 years old when she came to Paris. So she considered herself French, Parisian. Her younger brother was born there. So I would say culturally she most identified as French. So when the Nazis invaded Paris in, I think, 42 is when her family was taken. And she has there was a whole story about how she escaped to the roof of her building, and they must have known something was happening. Her younger brother was sent off to a Catholic farm ahead of time. And also in France, in Paris, they tended to take the adults, not the children. And my mother was very petite, and blonde, actually. She was blonde and green-eyed. So I think she passed in a lot of ways. There's a whole other story about my mom. But in terms of her illness, certainly there's a hereditary component to bipolar illness. My uncle was also afflicted, and in fact, 2 of my 5 siblings have been afflicted. So I think it's probably a combination of you carry a predisposition, and it doesn't help when you're exposed to tremendous circumstantial stress.
Did you say your mom's siblings or your siblings?
Her sibling, her brother, her only surviving brother,
family, right.
as well as 2 of my own. So clearly there's a genetic component.
Wow. So does that have anything to do with the career path that you chose as far as genetics go?
No. I'm doing genetics now, interestingly. No, I actually, it did influence me in the sense that when I first went to college, I started off in business for a smidgen of time, but ultimately went into psychology. I was a psych major, and then as time went on, I got into more the biology of psych. That I was more interested in the biology. Obviously, that influenced me, and ultimately became more and more interested in hard science and did research, and ultimately ended up in medicine because of that. So the genetics is only recent. I practiced as a surgeon for most of my career.
Can I ask, as 8 years old, your parents getting divorced isn't easy on any child, and then losing your mom at 19, right? How does a kid process that? Or did you fantasize about your mom, or was it a good relationship then, or was your dad swaying you away from her, or what was that struggle like? Or was there no struggle?
When I was 5, before I was 5, my mother was ill even during our early childhood. I don't know if my father knew about it or she even knew her diagnosis, in those days. However, when my mother had my youngest brother, when he was an infant, she had a breakdown and was hospitalized. And in those years, they didn't send you out in 30 days. She was hospitalized for at least 6 months. The only reason I know that is because I remember Halloween in an orphanage that took us in, 4 of the 5 of us. My brother was already in kindergarten, so he got to stay home with my father, and an aunt who lived nearby helped him, his sister. But the 4 of us were in an orphanage, at least from, I remember the Halloween decorations, and I remember some of the foods we were eating. So I remember we must have gone in Halloween, which is around October, which is only a few months after my little brother was born in July. And I remember also my father visiting me and telling me that I was turning 5, that it was my birthday, and that was late April. So I know we were in that orphanage or children's home for at least that period of time. So we were separated from her during that time. I remember when my mother must have been stable to be discharged, and then I remember my parents coming to pick up my sister and myself at that children's home to take us home.
You weren't up for adoption. You were just, your dad needed help.
Right. It was an orphanage that had children without parents, but we were there. It was a Jewish children's home to take care of us because essentially my father was working and my mother was hospitalized, and so there was nowhere else for us to go. His siblings, they had, 5 or 6 children of their own. He was coming from a very Orthodox Jewish family, and there was a question of splitting us up, and my father didn't want to split up. And ultimately, when we went back home, we had a pretty rocky next 3 years between the ages of 5 and 8. It was pretty rocky. My mother was in and out of shorter hospitalizations. There was fighting at home. But when it was good, it was very, very good. I think I took what I had, and I think I try to hold on to the good memories. And then it's interesting you asked about my thoughts about her. As many of us who lost a parent at an early time, I think we use our imaginations and embellish them, and then they become almost a combination, right, of a fantasy perfect mother blended with the memories we do have, which were essentially good ones. I don't like to dwell on the bad ones. So in that sense, I glorified her, but there isn't any other way I would want to remember her.
I don't think her intentions of being ill is what she wanted either.
Right.
You seem that you said that she was pretty magical and exposed you and your siblings to some beautiful things.
She was really a hero. I mean, when I reflect on what she survived herself, and then what we had a pretty chaotic situation, but nothing near what she survived and endured, and became, like you said, a warrior, and a really stood up as an example of somebody who comes out good on the other end.
Often people talk about the more challenges you have in your life, the stronger you will be, the better your path will be because of that, because of those obstacles. And
yes.
Sometimes they're unbearable. You don't wish it on anybody, right?
Right. I mean, my sister, who's unfortunately also inherited the illness, but also, the effects on each of my siblings is very different. And I think because I was the oldest girl, I have an older brother, but I was the oldest girl. I was close with her. We were a week apart in birthdays, so I was her birthday baby. So I think there was something very special in our relationship. Not saying that she didn't love us all equally, but there was something more special in the way she and I related to each other and the responsibility that I took on. And so I think she and I, in that way, being the responsible adult female kind of role, and I think that in those ways she and I shared that. And also the singing, the music. I'm addicted to radio, and I'm addicted to music, and I love to sing. And absolutely, I mean, my father also was musical, and his father was a cantor, actually, my grandfather, as one of his part-time jobs. And so there was music on both sides, but certainly I was influenced by my mother and love of radio because she always had the radio on. She'd always be singing in the house. I love that era of music. She was always singing American songs, and she loved American movies. And, in a way that I recreated my mother from not only my experiences with her, but also media experiences and idealized motherhood because I had to. She also created idealized womanhood, I think, from her not having a mother around and from her having to be a young adult who then finished raising herself. So it's interesting. She was very influenced, I remember, by the Marilyn Monroes and the Betty Grables. She was petite and dyed blonde, but she was petite and blonde, and she had green eyes. And I don't know if you remember the pinups in the World War II era. Betty Grable was a pinup girl.
Yes, absolutely.
And her nickname was Betty. She said people called her Betty because she was petite and blonde and pretty, and she kind of looked a little bit like Betty Grable, so her nickname was Betty. But in terms of the influence, I was just kind of remembering that, the motherly advice she was able to give me was kind of funny because she herself didn't have a lot of mothering, and so she was good at it. But the motherly advice she sometimes gave me when I got a little older, like I think it came from movies like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Like I remember her saying, "Oh, it's just as easy to marry a rich man as a poor man." Those kind of things. I mean, she married a poor one, but so it didn't make sense. But I remember her kind of trying to teach us or me especially, giving me this womanly advice. And there were also, I remember another one, which I think is more related to her and her French upbringing than movies or American culture. But I don't know about you, but there's sort of this thing. I think American moms always tell their kids, always put on clean underwear. You never know when you're going to get hit by a car. But my mother would say,
Catholics.
What?
Catholics.
Did your mother ever say things like that?
Well, I obviously know of it. I don't know if my mom ever said it, but it's like
right.
either the nuns
other
or
people's
my
mothers, like, don't run with scissors, you'll poke your eye out, those kinds of things, right? All these, like, terrible things that can happen.
Uh-huh.
But I remember my mother once telling me, always wear clean underwear. You never know when you can meet a nice man. So she had a sense of humor, and she was very earthy, right? She was earthy, and I'm pretty earthy. Ultimately, it served me well because I did go into surgery, and I was surrounded by men, and I don't get as easily offended by that kind of humor. So in that way, I guess her mothering did influence me.
Did your mom go to school?
Oh, she went to school. That's another thing. Between my father, who was born and grew up in Brooklyn, and pretty, like, kind of lower middle class, and my mother, who was poor in France but sophisticated, I absolutely think that if she had had the chance, she would have gone to university. She didn't, because, obviously everything happened to her at 17, but she was very, sophisticated in the sense that she was in Paris. She had, like, a Parisian sense of sophistication and culture and education, and she was a secular Jew. My father was the Orthodox Jew. My mother became more Orthodox when she married him, but for sure her English was twice as good as my father's. I mean, my father was a Brooklyn, D's, Dem, and Does. He's still alive, My father was more a D's, Dem, and Does type of Brooklyn guy, and my mother was, the root of this word comes from this Latin etymology, So my mother was certainly fluent in French, fluent in English. She was the big reader in the family and read to us. So my love of books, too, comes from her. She missed out on a lot in her life. She gave me both of my parents, whatever they could. And then we took it from there because, we didn't have a lot of money, but we had a lot of oomph. We had a lot of go-get-it energy, and we did it. It's like, you only have a few marbles in your hand, and so you play with only those marbles over and over again. So although there weren't many experiences, they became very crystallized, and they became very strong. And so, the music, the nature, the flowers, the interest in people. Another thing, she, not having family, obviously, she was so big-hearted. I remember, this is also very interesting because it's not common in insular Orthodox Jewish families, which we were, because she became Orthodox when she married my father, and we lived a very Orthodox life until I went to college. But I remember we had a little backyard in the basement apartment in Brooklyn, because we lived in a little basement apartment, under the stairs in a brownstone when we were very young. And, of course, some of these memories are amplified by some few photographs that we have of childhood. But I remember her inviting over Kamala and Maya, these two Indian women who wore saris, and they'd be in the back rose garden, and she would invite them for tea. And then there was this salesman who sold pens door to door. He was a refugee from Hungary, and she would invite him in for tea. And so, interestingly, as young children, we were, because of my mother, and she was an unusual wife for an Orthodox Jewish man. When I say Orthodox, I'm talking Brooklyn, Brooklyn black coats. And my father was a little bit more liberal than his brothers and sisters, who were very, very religious and insular. And so my mother opened the world up for him as well. But even from an extremely young age, we were exposed to basically a broad range of people and a love of many different cultures simply by her inviting in other people in the neighborhood. So I think my love of people and my love of, and also growing up in New York City, you're exposed to so many people, but it started with my mother and her being open and her treating other people as like everybody's related. We're all family. And whatever little she had, she shared it.
Oh my gosh, she's pretty
I
amazing.
feel like crying, but I'm not going to.
You can cry. If you don't cry, I'll cry.
I think I love Indian culture and Indian friends because of her relationship with those two ladies. They were a mother and a daughter, and I don't know, just remembering a lot of those things.
Your mom was here for a short period of time, and there are families here today that don't have that immersion in a short period of time as this gift that your mom gave you, one of the many gifts that your mom gave you.
Yes.
So we know your mom was smart and she was open-minded. Is there anything else that sticks out in your mind that you wanted to share?
The other thing that was different about my mom, I talk about faith and I talk about her, I wouldn't say converting, but, she was Jewish, but taking on like a very Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. But interestingly, her younger brother, and again, this was probably influenced by the trauma of the war, he went completely the other way and actually converted to Christianity and married my aunt, who is Protestant. And so my mother also opened up, again, those doors. Although I was raised in an Orthodox way and we went to yeshiva, to parochial school, the doors were still open to understanding other walks of faith. And my mother herself, her first husband, hadn't been Jewish, and so she had that spiritual door open. It wasn't about what religion you practiced. It was about your faith and your spirituality. And I think that was a huge influence, and thank God. What can I say? It's kind of ironic to say that, but thank God I had that too. If you don't, I would say the biggest gift she gave me was that strong faith, because certainly I held onto it to carry myself through the kinds of things that we went through as children and even into adulthood. So I remember, like Christmas songs, which are very popular. I mean, we knew all the Christmas songs. I love Christmas music. I think it's because my mother loved it. And I remember her, always singing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And, the lyrics are very poignant. I don't know if you've ever listened closely.
To Rudolph Red-Nosed Reindeer?
The lyrics are very poignant because nobody wanted to be Rudolph's friend. He was the outcast, which is certainly the experience that she had as a Jew in Nazi Europe, right? And yet, in the end, makes out okay in the end and becomes the front runner. And so when I think of just that simple children's song, which is one of the Christmas songs she used to sing in our house around Christmas time, I don't know if it was to my father's consternation, but whatever. We know all the words to all the Christmas songs because of her. But when I hear Rudolph at Christmas time, I always think of her.
What a great memory. So are you who you are today because of or in spite of your mother?
I would say because of her as a person and in spite of the hardships that she endured and the illness that she had. So both. But all of it, right? All of it had such a huge influence on me.
Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Hannah Brooks.
Oh, my God, thank you so much for letting me talk about these things.
I had no idea what was coming, and every episode that I do of this podcast, I'm just floored by hearing these stories of these women that have impacted our life. So I really thank you. So
no fights, no bad stuff, completely protected me. If my father yelled at me about a bad grade, and of course, ultimately, they were all good. But when I was young, I remember her one time they were fighting, and my mother literally stood in front of me to protect me from my father's onslaught.
Oh.
So no,
Oh my
no
God.
real, right? I mean, she was she was a fierce mom. I can't say that I ever. Maybe I would have fought with her. I was protected from having to be a teenager and living right as a. So I only, in some ways, it's a blessing to only have the good and not, in some ways, experience the fighting that's so common when you're a teenager with your mom, or the criticism that she never, ever, ever, or the anger that she never ever put on, laid on, burdened us with.
Yeah, she was fearless. Boy, she was
Yeah.
fearless because of all that she had endured.
Yeah. So I can't say that I would that it. This was God's plan. It would not have happened any other way, and because of her, I can't think of any other experience that I had with her that isn't a blessing. Even the bad stuff.
I applaud you for having that philosophy and that point of view, because it isn't easy. You say, what child should endure something like that? But you've turned it around, and she turned it around. It
Anyway,
happens.
okay. Well, I'm crying, but I'm happy. Thank you
Tears
so
of
much.
joy. Thank
It was
you.
so just such a great experience for me to be able to talk about this openly, which I don't know if I could have done it at an earlier age. I mean, it's good. Some things are good to be over 60, right?
Absolutely. I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. Thank you, Hannah, so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
Dr. Hannah Brooks, board-certified surgeon, breast cancer specialist, and geneticist. And you never know what's going to come up during one of these conversations. My email is jackie@shouldhavelistenedtomymother.com, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for joining me.